Okay, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have you here at this climate series. I'm Rod Downing from Vancouver, BC, Canada. The overall goal of this series, as you may know, is quite simple, and that is to move the needle from our current destructive patterns toward a sustainable flourishing of life for all. It's that civil rights, eyes on the prize. We keep going until the goal is achieved. Now, each month, as a reminder, during the fall and winter and moving out to the summer, we will be hosting a presentation each month by an expert in their field, followed by conversations such as we're having today. Now, last Sunday, we had the climate scientist, Dr. Richard Gammon, who shared the basic science behind the climate crisis. Now, Dr. Gammon, as you see, will be returning in January, and even with a bonus, a dialogue with President Veazey. And we will begin focusing on how to mitigate the effects of carbon emissions and global warming. The main thing is to check out our website for the schedule, details, archives. His session is up there now. You can go look at it because he went through it with lightning speed and action items. So today's conversation builds on Dr. Gammon's presentation. It allows us to deepen the impact and grapple together. And then as a final point, during this session, we'll be going into great breakout groups twice. So please remember the basic rules. We are all God's children. We need each other. That's community. Be sure to separate people from issues and thus grant each person their God-given dignity and self-respect. In doing so, we'll all be greatly enriched. We're grateful for the GPNW Mission Center for sponsoring this series. And at this time, I will turn it over to Joan. And Sean, if you will need to unmute the people for this. Joan?
Thanks, Rod. For those of you who were attended last Sunday's presentation by Dr. Gammon, we asked you to take away from that one or two things that you found most impactful. So we want to give you an opportunity to discuss that now. And here's how we're going to do it. We've got 3 questions on the screen. You don't have to answer all of them, whichever one works the best for you. When you're ready to say a single sentence, we want to keep it fairly short, about 30 seconds. There's not as many people on as there are sometimes, so 30 seconds is good. We can maybe even go as long as 40 seconds. When it's getting to be the 30 seconds, crash, boom, I will sound a chime like this to tell you that your 30 seconds is up and you need to wrap it up. So if you can put your hand up in the participant list. I don't know if you all know how to do that, if you've done it before, but at the bottom of the screen, there's an icon that says participants. And when you click that a list comes up on the right-hand side. And at the bottom of that list is a little button you can click to say, or at least it should be, it's not on mine at the moment, but I think that's because I'm a host, that will say raise hand. And once that's raised, it'll say lower your hand. So this is your opportunity to share with the group now what was most impactful for you, or what was one new thing, or what do you think is going to make a big impact on you personally?
Excuse me just a moment, but I will need to share my screen. So I will take notes on what people say, and you can see it as I type it up on the screen. Thank you.
And of course, my participant list is acting up. I'm not seeing any hands up. So maybe nobody has thought of anything to say just yet. Or if you're not comfortable with putting your hand up electronically, you can always put your hand up.
Oh, Colleen, I think. Colleen raised her hand.
Okay, Colleen.
Yes, I'll start us off then. I just watched it. I'm catching up to this whole series. And two things struck me. One was when I'm feeling like things are warmer, the slide where he showed regular cool days, normal days, warmer days, extreme warm days, and how that's shifting. And when he said it's not the new normal because it's progressing. And that really hit me. And then the second thing was the map of uninhabitable parts of our world and the issue we'll face as having so many climate refugees.
Pat and Jim. I see your hands raised, Pat and Jim.
Pam and Jim, you'll have to unmute yourself.
So while you're doing that, Diane Weberly, you wanted to mention your takeaway?
Just to kind of go a little bit onto the refugee part, I hadn't heard anybody talk about actually a migration of refugees because of climate issues. Like he talked about a lot of people from the South, if you're looking at the United States, moving up to northern climates, and the same sort of thing happening in other places of the world. That was really a surprise to me.
Thank you.
Claudia Baggerly.
I did not understand that we could actually heal the atmosphere. I thought the damage we'd done would be permanent, but it was encouraging that that's possible.
Yep, Pat and Jim.
Am I on now?
Yes, you are.
Actually, the thing that struck me about it was I was so impressed that our church is doing this, understanding that we need to be brought up to all of the things that are happening. We have been following this very closely, the different things that are occurring on the earth, and the ozone being destroyed, and the fires and the earthquakes and things. And so we had been, I think, aware of most of the things. Probably the timeline were the things that were the most distressing to me.
I think one thing that bothered me the most was the pollution of the oceans, and how the oceans are going to be, you know, that's the major part of our earth, and how they're dying, and the animal life in there are not doing well, the coral are being destroyed. And so I was really alarmed by how the carbon dioxide gets into the ocean and then it keeps suffering.
Yes. Darcy?
I'll admit I got lost in a lot of the science on Sunday, but one thing that was new to me was, I believe it was capturing CO2 and inserting it into the soil. Am I on the right track? Was that mentioned? And that was
Yes.
something that I had not really been aware of in past discussions.
The technology exists. The dollars haven't been assigned to it.
Okay, we want to say something.
David and
Yes.
Jan, yes. The
Well,
DeBarths.
I heard, I wish I could remember at this stage. I don't remember everything he said by any means, but I was caught by his assurance of technology is going to solve our problems. That really concerns me though, because I hear an awful lot from the people who say, don't worry about climate change, technology will solve our problems. And he talked about the capturing of carbon dioxide and putting it back underground. Well, right now that's too expensive. So that just isn't happening that much. There's wonderful possibilities. People are putting together things like trying to create artificial, can't even say the word, where the plants take the carbon dioxide and oxygen and build plant material, photosynthesis. Can we artificially produce photosynthesis to pull carbon dioxide? Those technologies are being talked about, and capturing carbon and putting it underground has been tried, but so far to say technology is going to solve our problems scares me, because it allows people to just go ahead and say, we don't have to worry about it. Technology is going to rescue us. I'm not convinced that's true.
Okay, thank you. We
Thank
have
you.
time for one more. Is there?
I think Kim.
Kim?
Yes, we watched the movie Kiss the Ground after the Sunday lecture here. And Dave just referred to Darcy about the promise of healing the atmosphere, which I didn't know we could do either, and also the promise of changing the way big ag farms.
What?
Changing the way that big agriculture farms to heal the earth.
Thank you, everyone, for that sharing. We'll have more time for conversation after a bit, but now Rod is going, I think it's Rod next.
Sorry, it can take a couple minutes to get the one screen down and the other screen up. And I've got to advance now. So what I'm going to then just spend a few minutes doing is our committee also did exactly what you have just done, is sort of summarize some of our takeaways. And let me start by saying he showed 60 slides in 45 minutes. So if you felt your head was swimming by the end, that's why. He goes lightning fast. We sure didn't capture everything, and what I'm presenting is not everything. it's just some of the things that sort of stood out to us, because otherwise we'd be here for in the next hour highlighting all that stuff. So let's take a look at what we at least put. Now, we divided it into a few areas. The first was climate disruption. And starting at the very beginning, scientifically, it is extremely likely that climate change is underway and human caused. That is an important official statement that comes from the IPCC, that UN body, and is very critical to the global conversation because there are still some who don't feel that way. But scientifically, those thousands of scientists, that's where they are. Carbon in the atmosphere has increased, and he listed 3 of them: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And he also mentioned the some other ones as well. Burning of fossil fuels is the primary reason that that curve is going up, and that's coming from the IPCC. It is our burning of the fossil fuels that's doing that. And as someone mentioned, the concern about the ocean, yes, 80 to 90% of the heat gets trapped in the ocean. So those are just some of the disruptions that we as humans are doing. So consequences and projections. Global temperature, we've already gone up a degree. We all, I think, have a sense of the droughts and fires. The polar ice cap and the sea ices are melting, which leads to sea level rise. Dr. Gammon's oceans hot, sour, breathless, and toxic. Again, the oceans are so massive, you just think they aren't changing, but once they get measured, yes, they are. And already half the coral reefs are gone. Millions of people. There are people already being displaced, let's be clear. They just aren't particularly in our domain, but in other areas I could get into that, but won't. But there are already people being displaced. So some of the further projections that he mentioned, we could reach 4 or 5 degrees higher by 2050, sorry. You may have caught the image of the drought in Africa, India, and the Americas, these bands. That's actually on the next picture you'll see in a moment. The polar ice cap could be gone. And if you remember his grandchild standing on the beach, who will be underwater by 2100, by the time he's a grown up, 4 to possibly 8 foot rise. Catastrophic storms, and there already is an extinction of species. It's just going to increase. Coral reefs will be completely wiped out and billions of people displaced. And very striking, of course, those who contribute the least to the greenhouse gases are the most impacted. In other words, those in the darkest red are those who are going to be most impacted. And they were the ones who have been the least to contribute to the greenhouse gases. So there is a very much a justice issue, and that's why we called ourselves the Climate Justice Team, because that's at the heart of any religious organization. Finally, some mitigation goals. No more carbon emissions into the atmosphere, try and peak by 2025, remove CO2 from the atmosphere to net zero. stop all deforestation now. And this next point's really a sub-point of that. One way is to pay Brazil and other countries, because we live in a world that the national level has the ultimate say. Who are we to say what Brazil should do? Who is Brazil to say what Canada should do? That's the world we live in. And if we're going to come together as a global community, we have to find ways around that. That's one of them. Scale up safe, green power generation. He was very clear about that, and electrify everything. So compared to some of your key points, I think you covered quite a few of those, from the migration issues to the problems with the ocean, and we didn't say a lot about the existence of the technology. We recognize that that's a possibility. He basically said when sort of the equivalent of oil getting to $100 a barrel, that's what it would cost to be cost effective to start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's doable now. Oil companies do it all the time. The technology's there. It's just going to be too pricey till it's $100. That also gets to the point that someone made about relying too much on technology. We're clear, and I think Gammon maybe wasn't crystal clear, but implicit is he sees technology as one aspect of the solution. It's sort of like let 1,000 flowers bloom and see which ones will be part of the ultimate solution. Technology may have its place, but no, if you remember, what's he doing now? He's on Whidbey Island, with one of the small community groups trying to engender a more amongst us humans, a humane and human creative response. So just judging by his actions, he sees the responsibility is primarily ours. There are several other things that could be said, but this time is not for me to blab on. This time is to join together in discussions. So at this point then, what I would like to do is have us move out into our first breakout group. And in this, we'll have 12 minutes. So first of all, introduce yourself and then share how you're feeling about what you've heard. Overwhelming, wow, I got a new insight. Whatever you are feeling now or felt during that presentation, that's where we would like to start now. Let me simply I just have to check one little thing. Yes. So Sean, if you would hit that button and put us into breakout groups, we'll have 12 minutes together, and then we'll have a second breakout group later.
I was wondering who should be unmuting themselves, and it turns out it was me. So at the end of the presentation the other day, Dr. Gammon put up a saying from the Talmud that he didn't have time to to look more deeply in, but I'm inviting us to look more deeply at this and just listen with our hearts for a moment to this challenging passage from the Talmud. It is an expansion on a familiar scripture. Do not be daunted. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you or I free to abandon it.
Okay, I'm just going to take a few minutes. I have to be really careful because I can go on and on forever. If I go beyond my 6 minutes, committee, somebody, cut me off somehow, but I'll try and do it. What we wanted to do is just take one key point from what he mentioned and pursue it for a couple of minutes. And that was that during the start of the pandemic, those first few weeks, the streets were empty, or at least in my area. It was just this night and day response when everyone stayed home and everyone was basically we weren't sure what in the world was happening other than that it was major. We reduced our carbon emissions by roughly 7%. And Professor Gammon mentioned that, and he said, if we could replicate that every year until 2050, we'd definitely meet our targets. Now, what I wanted to raise up is that recognition that what we did back then, and it's sort of eased off and the numbers are going up and people are getting more relaxed, but in that critical period, that 7% drop in the carbon emissions globally, I mean, that's an amazing feat brought about by the pandemic. The point being that is the scope of the response that we're going to need, is an almost pandemic-like response for the next 50 years. Now, for sure, this 7% gives a scope of the issue of what's needed, but it's not a prescription of how we're going to get there. We're not going to keep doing this pandemic stuff each year, making another 7% drop. I mean, I didn't take any flights this year. I can't reduce that another 7% next year or the year after. But that does, hopefully, if we pause, my gosh, look at what changed. But also look at what happened. And that's what I want to spend 2 or 3 minutes on. So the key is partly I want to separate out individual acts from the systemic changes needed. Because what took place here was a combination. There were the individual acts, the hand washing, the wearing the masks, the keeping social distance, the staying home, those types of things. That was part of it. But there were also systemic changes that took place. And it's actually, I make a note of it at the bottom. It is the level of systemic changes that have occurred when we have been able to come together and say yes to a looming or impending dire crisis. Whether it was FDR during the Depression, and he inaugurated the New Deal, an almost unheard of thing at the time, whether it was World War II, and the incredible mobilization, the changes, same thing that happened with the pandemic. You would have these industries switch around and suddenly be making oxygen machines or PPEs or things like that. And suddenly you had governments, if you take the US, where previously, $1 million for something like that, it's impossible. And then suddenly $2-3 trillion is suddenly on the table. So the point is that we can make these incredible personal changes. We all had to do a lot of them. We're getting a little tired of them, but we could do them. But we could also make those huge systemic changes. The Marshall Plan, if you want a peaceable kingdom, follow Jesus, the peaceful one. Wow, there's your example. Take your enemy, Japan and Germany, and rather than keep them as your enemy, rebuild them and look at them today. They would never be our enemy again. They've rebuilt, they're healthy, they're happy. Wow, what a way to go. So can't spend a lot of time on that, but simply a lesson from the pandemic is both individually and systemically, keep those two separate. We will need them both. And the individual can feed into the systemic because the systemic needs that political constituency. So the two are related, keep them separate, but they are possible. We are capable of such enormous changes. Final point on that is Project Drawdown is one of the best sites if you want to see, like it lists hundreds of things that can change. And at the top of the list, sort of, is not wasting our food. Believe it or not, that's one of the things that can make as much difference as anything else. You would have thought it was electricity or whatever. Anyway, just an example of, hey, we're not alone. There have been people working on this for a long time. It's just a matter of joining together, taking all these loose and unorganized things, bringing them together in a whole, and being steadfast or undaunted, like that poem gave. Sorry, boy, I think you could tell I will want to go on. Nope, we're going to move on because this is time for you. And that's what we want to hear from. So let me read this quote again. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So we are going to go into breakout groups again for this time for 30 minutes. This is the bigger session. And in this session, what are the implications for you and the lives of the people you love as you consider the changes that are needed? And what that annual 7% reduction, again, it's not a case of duplicating exactly that every time. No, of course not. But what changed in your life during the pandemic to make that first decrease happen? And how can we widen it? What other ways? How do we expand this, broaden this impetus that we have seen? So that's where we want to spend the bulk of our remaining time. And again, Sean, if you will break us out into our groups.
We probably have everyone back. Let me welcome everyone back. There was another poem that was read, not read, but that was on Dr. Gammon's slides by Adrian Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. So in our breakout groups, we've been just dipping our toes in the water of what reconstituting the world at a rate of 7% per year that still preserves the possibility of relationship with each other might look like and what it might require. So we have about, do we still have 10 minutes, gang? How much time do we have? 5. So we have 5 minutes, and I'm just going to invite single sentences. I think we're a small enough group. But just with what you've heard and what's stirring in you, and what that 7% reconstitution might look like year over year. What did you hear? What did you learn? What are you taking away? And so you could we could do a hand raising thing. Pat and Tim, or Pat and Jim, or Pat. I'm going to assume you're Pat, but you got to unmute yourself. 5 minutes.
Unmuting now?
Yep.
Well, anyway, I've been excited by this, by the possibilities and the things that we can do. God bless.
I saw another hand. Rod.
Someone in our group mentioned, as we proceed with that we have to be careful that we don't leave people behind, that we don't create more injustice, that we bring everyone along.
Who else? Well, I noticed in our group, our discussion was less about those physical things we can do and about the condition of the vision of the world that we want to create in terms of being relational and not leaving people behind. Who else? Colleen raised hand.
I love the passage from the Talmud that you had on the screen. And what's really sitting with me is that we don't have to do all of the work alone, but we're not excused from being part of it. So thank you for that.
I'm not keeping track of the time, so I'm going to assume Joan's going to jump in when she's ready. Where is, Kitty.
Yes. I think what I've enjoyed about the evening is picking up some new language. How do we say things? How do we talk about things? I think words are so important. And I just really appreciate what I've heard tonight. Thank you for that. Thank you very much.
Okay, we don't want to cut anyone off, but our time is drawing to a close. So I want to thank everyone for coming and being with us and taking part in the conversation this evening. Whether you've been learning about and taking action around climate disruption for decades, or your concern is more recent, wrapping our heads around the enormity of the challenge isn't easy. As Rod mentioned earlier, it's important to first take the time to really understand the science and the timeline of our future reality before we can move on to what we need to do in response. We hope that conversations such as what we've had this evening are helpful to each of you in processing this information. So this evening's conversation will be repeated on Sunday afternoons. Hopefully the slide is where you can see it, you can see the times. If it would be helpful for you to join again on Sunday afternoon and go through the conversation again with different people in their breakout groups, so that will be different. Go ahead and please do so. Plus, you may want to plan to join us in January for the presentation and the follow-up conversations as we begin to look at what can and must be done to mitigate, not prevent. It's too late to prevent, but we can mitigate the most dire possibilities for our future. We'll also be talking then about climate audit, something that Dr. Gammon mentioned in the Q&A part of the presentation this past Sunday, in learning what's involved in doing a climate audit or using a climate calculator to establish a baseline of where we're at now so we know how much we each have to reduce and how to go about setting up groups of people who want to participate in that process. Future topics will include biodiversity loss, the response of the faith community, economic impact, and humanitarian needs. We also want to hear from you. You can message us through the website or email any one of us about what you want to know more about or talk more about. Between now and our January session, consider watching some documentaries and are doing some research online if you haven't already. But a couple of cautions. First of all, the information can be overwhelming, so don't try to do it all. And second of all, not everything is as scientifically sound. And that's why we felt it was important to start with the IPCC science. So that as you come across other things, you can put them in perspective. So the counsel that's been given to Community of Christ in recent years says this: both the challenges and the opportunities before us are momentous. I think that's a very significant sentence that so often we focus on just the challenges, but it's also the opportunities are momentous. When we approach such changes with a clear understanding of the realities, but also with a grounding in the knowledge that actions we can take can reduce and will reduce some amount of future pain and suffering, then we can approach the future with hope. And so we wish to leave you with words, a part of a poem that was shared in our October conversation, A Bridge of Hope, by Karen Kunkel. And hopefully those words are on the screen for you now. When we come to the abyss, snakes, fires, midnight whole nightmares, whatever, down below, we know, we must sing the old refrain of hope. It is only by singing out we are heard. It is the raising of the voice that changes the singer. We must be brave enough to be changed, for in the speaking we are changed. In the trying to name, we are discovered.